I found out my husband was planning to leave me on a random Tuesday night, not because he sat me down like an adult, not because he showed even a shred of respect for the 10 years we'd spent together, but because he casually said, "I think I've found someone new," while scrolling on his phone like he was talking about a new show he wanted to watch. My chest went cold, my ears rang, and the first thought that flashed through my mind wasn't even sadness, it was disbelief. After everything I had sacrificed, everything I had forgiven, everything I had endured for this man, he was ready to walk away like I was nothing. And the worst part is, he had no idea that just hours later, he'd be standing in front of me, pale and shaking, reading something I had handed him, nearly dropping it as his entire version of reality collapsed. So tell me honestly, before you judge me too harshly, was I wrong for what I did next? Let me take you back to the beginning, because this didn't happen overnight, and I didn't become this person in a vacuum. I met my husband, Daniel, when I was 24. I was fresh out of university, working my first real job. Broke but hopeful, and convinced that love was enough to get you through anything. Daniel was charming in that quiet, confident way. He wasn't loud or flashy, but he listened, or at least I thought he did. He remembered small details about me, like how I took my coffee and how I hated driving on highways. When he asked me to move in with him, after just 8 months I hesitated, but he told me, "When you know, you know." I wanted to believe that so badly that I ignored the little voice in my head telling me to slow down. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony. Nothing fancy, but it was full of laughter and promises. I remember standing there, looking at him, thinking I was the luckiest woman alive. I truly believed we were a team. And for a while, we were. Or at least, I thought we were. I supported him through job changes, long nights, and his constant fear of failure. When he decided to quit a stable job to find himself, I picked up extra shifts. When he wanted to start a small business that barely made any money for the first 2 years, I paid most of the bills. I told myself this was what love looked like: sacrifice, patience, and trust. But somewhere along the way, the balance shifted. I became the responsible one, the planner, the safety net. Daniel became distant, distracted, and increasingly critical. He'd make comments about my appearance, about how I didn't tray, like I used to, ignoring the fact that I was exhausted from working full time and carrying the emotional weight of our entire life. Whenever I brought up how lonely I felt, he'd say I was overreacting or being dramatic. I started doubting myself. I started wondering if maybe I really was the problem. The cracks became impossible to ignore about a year ago. Daniel started coming home late. At first, it was work, or so he said. Then it was just grabbing a drink with friends. His phone was always face down, always locked, and if I walked into a room, he'd suddenly swipe out of whatever he was doing. I didn't want to be that wife, the suspicious one, the paranoid one. I told myself that if I trusted him, things would get better. Spoiler alert, they didn't. The night he told me he found someone new is burned into my memory. We were sitting in the living room, the TV on but muted, the kind of silence that feels heavy and wrong. He didn't even look at me when he said it, just those words, flat and casual. I remember asking him, "Are you cheating on me?" And he shrugged. He actually shrugged, like it was an annoying question. He said, "I didn't plan for it to happen, but I met someone who makes me feel alive again." Alive again. As if I had sucked the life out of him by loving him. I didn't scream. I didn't cry right away. I felt strangely calm, like my body went into survival mode. I asked him what he wanted. He said he needed time and space, and that he thought it would be best if we separated. That was it. No apology, no accountability, no acknowledgement of the decade we'd shared. He went to bed that night like nothing had happened, while I sat on the couch until morning, staring at the wall, replaying every moment of our marriage in my head, wondering where I went wrong. The next day, something in me shifted, the shock wore off, and a cold clarity took its place. I realized that while Daniel thought he held all the cards, he had severely underestimated me. You see, there were things he didn't know. things I had discovered quietly over the past few months. Things I hadn't confronted him about because I wasn't ready, because I needed to be sure, and because a part of me was still hoping I was wrong. It started with a letter. An actual, physical letter that arrived at our house addressed to him, in handwriting I didn't recognize. I wasn't snooping. It was sitting right there on the counter, and when I picked it up to move it, I noticed it had no return address. Something felt off. I didn't open it right away. I waited, but when days passed and he didn't mention it, curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a brief but intimate message from a woman thanking him for a wonderful weekend, and saying she couldn't wait to see him again. My hands shook as I read it, but instead of confronting him, I took a photo and put the letter back exactly where it was. After that, I started paying attention. I checked our shared financial accounts and noticed unfamiliar charges: hotel rooms, expensive dinners, gifts I never received. I dug deeper and found that Daniel had opened a credit card in his name only, something we'd agreed we wouldn't do without discussing it. I started keeping records. Screenshots, dates, times. Not because I was plotting revenge, at least not consciously, but because I needed the truth. And the truth, once you start uncovering it, has a way of piling up. I found emails too. Not explicit, but intimate enough to leave no doubt. He wasn't just emotionally invested in this other woman, he was building a parallel life. He talked to her about his dreams, his frustrations, even about me, painting himself as the neglected husband trapped in a loveless marriage. Reading those messages felt like being erased. Like my entire existence had been rewritten to suit his narrative. What hurt the most wasn't even the affair itself, but how calculated it all was. He had been planning his exit for months, maybe longer. He was lining things up so he could leave comfortably, without consequences. And I realized that if I did nothing, if I just accepted what he was offering, I'd walk away with nothing but heartbreak while he moved on, guilt-free, to his shiny new life. That's when I decided I wasn't going to play the role he had assigned me. I wasn't going to be the blindsided, abandoned wife who quietly packed her things and disappeared. I started talking to a lawyer, quietly, carefully. I learned about my rights, about what I was entitled to after years of supporting him financially and emotionally. I learned things that made my stomach twist, but also things that gave me a sense of power I hadn't felt in a long time. At the same time, I kept acting normal, or at least, as normal as I could. I cooked dinner, I asked about his day, I pretended I didn't notice when he smiled at his phone. Inside, I was falling apart, but I was also building something, a plan. Not to destroy him but to protect myself, and maybe, just maybe, to make him finally face the consequences of his actions. A week after his announcement, Daniel told me he was going to stay with a friend for a while. He said it would make things easier. I nodded and helped him pack a bag. He looked relieved, like a weight had been lifted. Before he left, he hugged me awkwardly and said, "I hope we can be civil about this." Civil. That word echoed in my head long after the door closed behind him. That night, alone in the house that suddenly felt too big, I gathered everything. The screenshots, the bank statements, the letter, the emails. I organized them neatly into a folder. Then I added one more thing. Something he would never expect. Something that represented not just his betrayal, but his lies, his manipulation, and the way he had underestimated me every step of the way. So that's the situation I was in, betrayed, exhausted, but no longer blind. I had a choice to make: confront him immediately and let him spin his story, or wait, prepare, and make sure that when the truth came out, it hit him all at once. Before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you about the moment he read what I handed him and nearly fell apart right in front of me, I want you to pause for a second and put yourself in my shoes. If you discovered your partner was leaving you for someone else after years of sacrifice, would you confront them right away, or would you wait and protect yourself first? Comment below what you would have done, because what I chose to do changed everything. I spent the next few days in a strange limbo. Part of me mourned the life I thought I had, The future I imagined, the version of Daniel I believed in. Another part of me felt sharper, more focused than I'd ever been. I replayed conversations in my head and saw them differently now, through a lens of truth instead of denial. Every dismissive comment, every unexplained absence, every time he made me feel small suddenly made sense. Daniel texted me occasionally, short, polite messages about logistics. When could he come by to get more clothes? Did I want to keep the couch? Could we talk? Soon. I replied calmly, never revealing what I knew or what I was preparing. Each message from him felt surreal, like we were actors reading lines from a script neither of us had written. One afternoon, he asked if we could meet to talk things through. I agreed and suggested we meet at the house. I wanted him on familiar ground. I wanted him comfortable. I spent that morning cleaning, not because I cared what he thought, but because I needed my environment to feel controlled. I placed the folder on the dining table, straightened the chairs, and waited. When he walked in, he looked different. Lighter, maybe, but also cautious. He sat across from me and started talking about how hard this was for him, how he never meant to hurt me, how he just needed to be honest with himself. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded in my lap, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. He finally stopped and looked at me expectantly, like he was waiting for forgiveness. Or at least acceptance. I took a deep breath and slid the folder across the table toward him. I told him, calmly, before we go any further, I need you to read this. He frowned, confused, but opened it anyway, and that's where I'm going to stop for now, because what happens next deserves its own moment, its own space. In the next part, I'll tell you exactly what was in that folder, how his face changed as he read it, and how the truth finally caught up to him in a way he never saw coming. If you think you know how this ends, trust me, you don't. Like this video if you're on my side so far, subscribe for more stories like this, and make sure you're here for part 2, because that's when everything truly falls apart. When Daniel opened that folder, I expected anger first, maybe denial, maybe some smug attempt to explain everything away like he always did. What I didn't expect was the color draining from his face so fast that for a second I genuinely thought he might faint. His fingers tightened around the papers as he flipped through them, one by one, faster and faster, like if he reached the end quickly enough, the contents would magically change. The room was silent except for the soft rustle of pages and the sound of his breathing getting shallow. I watched him carefully, not saying a word, because for the first time in years, he wasn't in control of the conversation. And before I tell you how he reacted, before I tell you what finally broke him, let me ask you again, if you were in my place, watching the person who betrayed you realize they'd been exposed completely, would you feel satisfaction, or would it still hurt just as much? Inside that folder was everything. The screenshots of his emails, printed out neatly, dates highlighted. The credit card statements showing hotel stays and expensive dinners on nights he claimed he was working late. A copy of the letter from the other woman. But the first few pages weren't even about the affair. I did that on purpose. The first thing he saw was a detailed breakdown of our finances from the last 10 years. Every bill I paid, every loan I co-signed, every month I carried us when his business was struggling. I wanted him to remember, in black and white, who had held this marriage together while he was out, finding himself. He finally looked up at me, his mouth opening like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. I broke the silence then, my voice steadier than I felt. I told him I knew about the affair, how long it had been going on, and that I knew about the way he'd been planning his exit. I told him I'd spoken to a lawyer. That word alone made his eyes widen. He asked me how long I'd known, and when I said, "Longer than you think," he laughed nervously and said, "You're being dramatic. This doesn't mean anything." That's when I slid the last document toward him. It was a printed draft of a separation agreement. Not signed yet, but detailed. It outlined what I was entitled to, what I would be asking for, and what I was willing to negotiate. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't vindictive. It was fair. But to him, it might as well have been a death sentence. He stared at it, then back at me, then back at the paper again, his hands shaking now. He said, "You can't do this." And for the first time in that entire conversation, I felt something close to power. I told him calmly that I absolutely could, and that if he wanted this separation to stay civil, he'd stop pretending he was the victim. I reminded him that while he was building a new life with someone else, I was the one still legally married to him, the one who had supported him for years. I asked him if he'd told someone new, the full truth about our finances, about how much he owed, about the fact that half of everything he had was tied to me. He didn't answer. He just stared at the table. Then came the moment I'll never forget. He whispered, "She doesn't know any of this." And suddenly, it all made sense. He hadn't just underestimated me, he'd been lying to her too. I realized that in his mind, I was supposed to quietly fade away, leaving him free to reinvent himself as the wronged husband who bravely started over. That story fell apart right there at my dining table. He tried to backpedal after that. He said, maybe we could work things out, that maybe he'd made a mistake. Hearing those words, after everything I'd seen and read, felt surreal. I actually laughed, a short, hollow sound that surprised both of us. I told him it was too late for that. I told him trust doesn't magically reappear just because the consequences finally show up. He looked genuinely shocked, like it had never occurred to him that I might choose myself. The conversation dragged on for hours. He cycled through emotions like a child throwing a tantrum. Anger, guilt, fear, bargaining. At one point he accused me of spying on him, of invading his privacy, as if that somehow outweighed months of betrayal. I reminded him that everything I had came from shared accounts or things sent to our shared home. I reminded him that his actions were the reason I'd had to protect myself in the first place. Eventually, he slumped back in his chair, defeated. Before he left, he asked if I hated him. That question hit harder than I expected. I told him no. I told him I didn't have the energy for hate anymore. What I felt was disappointment, deep, bone-level disappointment in the man I thought I married. He nodded slowly. Like that hurt more than anything else I could have said. He left without another word, and when the door closed behind him, I finally let myself cry. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and emotional whiplash. Daniel's tone changed completely. Gone was the casual confidence. Now he was careful, polite, even deferential. His lawyer contacted mine, and suddenly everything was formal and slow and exhausting. But something else happened too. The other woman reached out to me. She sent me a message late one night, apologizing for contacting me directly, but saying she needed answers. She said Daniel told her we'd been separated for years, that we were basically roommates, that I was cold and uninterested, and that he'd stayed out of obligation. Reading her message, I felt a strange mix of anger and pity. I sent her the truth, not insults, not threats, just facts. Screenshots, dates, evidence. I told her I wasn't trying to hurt her, but she deserved to know what kind of man she was involved with. She never replied, but a week later, Daniel called me, furious. He accused me of ruining his relationship. I told him calmly that he'd done that himself. That truth has a way of doing damage when lies have been holding everything together. He hung up on me, and for the first time since all this began, I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I finally felt free from the responsibility of protecting his image. As the legal process moved forward, I started rebuilding my life in small ways. I redecorated the house, turning spaces that once felt heavy into places that felt like mine again. I reconnected with friends I'd slowly drifted away from over the years. I started therapy, something I'd always put off because I was too busy holding everything else together. Slowly, painfully, I began to recognize myself again. The settlement took months, but in the end, it was fair. I didn't take everything. I didn't try to destroy him financially. I took what I was owed, what I'd earned through years of sacrifice. When the papers were finally signed, I felt a weight lift off my chest that I didn't even realize I'd been carrying for so long. Daniel tried to talk to me one last time after it was all finalized. He said he never thought things would turn out this way. I told him neither did I. But here we were. He asked if we could ever be friends. I didn't answer right away. Then I told him some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt, and that doesn't make anyone a villain. It just means the chapter is over. Now, looking back, I don't see myself as the woman who was left. I see myself as the woman who finally stopped accepting less than she deserved. What he read in that folder wasn't just evidence of his betrayal. It was proof that I was stronger, smarter, and more resilient than he ever gave me credit for. And yes, watching him nearly fall apart when he realized the truth was strangely validating, but it didn't heal me. What healed me was choosing myself. So that's my story. It's messy, painful, and far from perfect, but it's real. If you were on my side through all of this, if you think standing up for yourself doesn't make you cruel or vindictive, like this video, subscribe for more stories like this, because there are so many people out there who think they're alone in moments like these. And please, share your final thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you would have done. I read them all. I'll see you in the next story.